Okay, hey guys, today we're talking about the Marxist view of the state. Now, I didn't have a huge amount of time to prepare this, thanks to Nat once again, but hopefully that won't show too much in the talk, should be fine. But anyway, right. So, in order to properly understand the workings of capitalism, how it sustains itself, as well as functions in the functions of many modern-day institutions, the police, the media, etc., an understanding of the state is required. Now, the state through the Marxist lens is actually quite a simple definition. It's just a set of tools and apparatus used by one class to oppress another. The state is an agent of class struggle, and as such was not only brought into existence along with classes, but is codependent on them. A class society and a state cannot exist without the other. The composition of classes as well as the state can therefore be used to determine the stage-long history that humanity is in. For the majority of human existence, tribalism, there was no classes as we know them, as there was no private property, and classes are only defined by your relation to private property in the first place. And hence there was no state. This period of history was referred to by Marx and Engels as primitive communism, and it was effectively a stateless, classless society. However, to avoid any confusion, let it be clear that Marxists are in no way suggesting a return to this time in history, as class society was very much an improvement on primitive communism. However, we do believe that with industrialization, the concept of classes has served its purpose to humanity. The competition of the state and its corresponding classes is what has always defined the differences between these stages of history, i.e. the relations between the oppressor and the oppressed. This is one of the reasons Marxists believe it is the economic material basis that drives society, and it has done so for all of history. When Marxists refer to state apparatus, they mean tools used to ease class struggle in favor of those who own the state. Class struggle being the clash between two classes of diametrically opposed interests. For example, the slave and the slave owner, the lord and the serfs, or the capitalist and the worker. The forms of these tools depend once again on the structure of that particular class society. The same apparatus used under feudalism, such as knights to act as physical force to keep peasants in line under their respective lords, coupled with the priests to tell the peasants that the king is in his position because God put him there. These state apparatuses will take different forms, and the state under capitalism is different to the feudal state apparatus. However, it is undoubtedly more complex, although we can still draw parallels between them. Instead of knights, we have the police. Instead of priests, we have the media. To some, though, it may seem like pushing a conspiracy theory of sorts to suggest that all these things in society are quote-unquote out to get us. We know the police, for example, are the upholders of law, the only things between us and any murderer who we might look at the wrong way. To dispel such ideological notions, though, all we have to do is look at the origin of the police force. The police force originally started being used during the industrialization of countries, which would require the police to start being used around the mines and the factories when peasants were drawn in from the countryside against their will. Understandably, these peasants were quite unrestful and, again, needed this force to keep them doing their job for the capitalists. When workers went on strike or occupied a factory in order to get longer hours or higher pay, the police would be promptly sent in to use force to destroy this resistance. All throughout history, the police force have been used to quell labor movements through violent means. Even today, we see many cases of peaceful protesters having violence inflicted upon them. Only recently have strikes no longer been met with outright violence, and this is mainly because unions are no longer of any real potency anyway. And I can promise you, if workers were willing enough today to occupy factories in order to get concessions from employers, the nice friendly face of the police would dissolve in an instant. Even International Workers' Day exists, or International Women's Workers' Day, it exists in reference to an event in the US where many people in the labor movement at the time were outright unjustly killed by the police. The police from their origins and their actions still today prove time and time again that they serve in the interests of the ruling classes against the working class, and are part of the state apparatus used to oppress and fight the class struggle for the capitalists. The role of the media under capitalism, while not actually part of the state in a lot of cases, is still very much part of the state apparatus, due to the fact that it serves the interests of the ruling class and is owned by the ruling classes, much like the police force. The media's job is an obvious one, to push ideological narratives and justify the makeup of society, distract the populations from problems that have solutions which do not threaten the ruling class, for instance, blaming our crumbling infrastructure on immigrants rather than on the uncollected tax money from large corporations, and even uncollected tax money from those working in the very state. And lastly, to become the prime source of news to the population, giving the ruling class control over what the population should and should not hear about in regards to what is happening in the world. As I said, though, the state apparatus under capitalism is much more complicated than it ever was under feudalism or slavery. Two examples of additional apparatus which developed out of capitalism would be the welfare state and mass surveillance. Though, of course, Marxists, as Marxists, we support the idea of the welfare state, it's important to understand how it does actually benefit the capitalists. You see, unemployment under capitalism is a necessity, simply because with a bigger supply of potential workers to employ from, there'd be more competition between them, and so lower wages. If there's ever a capitalist society with no employment, the capitalists there would artificially create it themselves, simply because it's in their economic interest. Because of this, a welfare state is needed in order to give these unemployed workers just enough food as to not have them take to the streets, not even for a socialist cause, but just because they're starving. Mass surveillance, on the other hand, is a prime example of state apparatus which serves the capitalist interests. It's something that no ordinary person would actively think their society needs, but while under capitalism it doesn't really matter what the ordinary people want, it's because the ruling class want this. Even though there may be some people who don't care that everything they do online is actively monitored, I don't think there are many people who actively think we should have this in society. So, of course, we are told this is all in the name of fighting terrorism. But if this was really true, I can promise you that the majority of the mass surveillance would not be happening on places like Facebook and your personal emails. If anyone can tell me the last time a terrorist organization operated out of Facebook, I'd be impressed. No, real criminals use technology and methods that the government have no real way to actually get through, and any kind of criminal caught online is simply because they made a mistake. The government focused the majority of its surveillance on ordinary people because it's ordinary people that they're spying on. The way this serves the ruling class is twofold. Firstly, corporations will spy on people in order to gain data and information about them and then sell them off to advertisement companies for a profit. But the other way, and the less well-known way that this benefits the ruling class, is through something known as self-censorship. Essentially, when people know they're being spied on, they'll actively change what they say and what they look up, simply out of fear of being watched. And this leads to this limits the spread of information online and in general causes a more obedient population. It's in no way something that serves society, and so it has no place among us. Now, I've given a very rough overview of the bourgeois state. The alternative to this, of course, is a proletarian state. A proletarian state, or a worker state, is just like the bourgeois state in that it's a collection of tools and apparatus used by one class to enact its will against another class, but the form of the apparatus is changed to suit the interests of the workers instead of the capitalists. Such states have in fact existed in periods of time in history. One of the best examples of this would be the Paris Commune. And the fundamental differences between the state that the Paris Commune constructed and the state as we know it today are as follows. The representatives of the state were from the working class and were not elevated above it. They were paid at wages of that of a skilled worker. And they were also subject to recall at any time by the workers that elected them, as they were there to serve their interests. Unlike today, where we choose out from a selection of people from the ruling class with no obligation to carry out anything they say they will, with the fundamental issues untouched in society. In America today, for example, they get a choice between white Christian imperialism and diverse feminist imperialism. Of course, I'm referring to Republicans versus Democrats. Furthermore, the police force under the Paris Commune were replaced with a people's militia. How specifically a people's militia would function differs from society to society and time period to time period. But personally, I quite like the idea proposed by Lenin for St. Petersburg in his Letters from Afar when he was exiled in Sweden. where he outlines in that a city of a population of roughly 2 million people, if you just take half of that population and then take away a generous quarter of that to account for elderly and disabled, you could have a standing force of over 53,000 people a day if just each individual person were only volunteering for once every 2 weeks. In modern cities with much larger populations, the number would be much more favourable and stronger than any police force ever could be, while at the same time acting in the interest of the workers themselves because it would be made up of the workers themselves, as opposed to the agents of the capitalists. What the workers' state essentially becomes is not an authority above the working class, but rather a tool for them to enact their will, the will of those in the state being irrelevant. Essentially what the workers' state revolves around is the idea of capturing state power and wielding it for the working class as opposed to the capitalists. This is a requirement as opposed to the anarchist proposal of simply abolishing the state overnight, due to the simple fact that a revolution must have a way to defend itself. And to do this it needs a state, and it must be nationwide. There have been many, many attempts at socialism throughout history that have actually established working socialism, but only localized to 1 or 2 city-wide communes for various reasons. The most notable case of this would be the Paris Commune, but we've seen this happen in Hungary, Germany, Korea, Spain, Hungary again, Czechoslovakia, and Vietnam. All these instances of socialism were on communal levels, and never managed to properly take state power from the bourgeois before they were crushed by them. It is clear through history that residing to communal levels with small or no states at all will not serve to sustain the revolution. In order to defend a revolution, a nationwide worker state must be established that will trigger international revolution. When a revolutionary movement forms, it must also form its own military force. This force acts as a spearhead in the revolution against the bourgeoisie with the aid of the people, though of course it's also a requirement for any nationwide revolution, regardless of ideology, to spread their propaganda through pre-existing armies, so that that army can turn against itself and aid the revolution further. Once a new state is established, the remaining military resistance can be purged, and former pre-existing armies can come under the name of the Revolutionary Military Force, which is now loyal to the newly constructed state. Every successful 20th century and modern army has been centralized, and though you can implement varying degrees of external control over it through democratic means, every other imperialist army it will be faced against will also be centralized. It is safe to assume that if decentralizing an army was tactically superior on large scales, it would be done by pre-existing armies. So to not centralize a post-revolutionary army in response would essentially be suicide. So in having a functioning centralized army, it should be obvious that a state of some form would be required to handle it. This concept is mainly why anarchism as an ideology will almost always fail. It refuses to take control of state power in the way that Marxists do, and so cannot defend itself. Furthermore, instances in history of anarchist movements tend to have some forms of state anyway, just without calling them states. They still fell because they would not take full state power and establish an actual military force, but they would still establish people's militias in cities under their influences. We've already shown how people's militia is very much a part of the proletarian state apparatus and even advocated by Lenin himself. But even going by a more widely used definition of the state, and one that anarchists will often go by, a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, in what world is a people's militia not this? It should be obvious that under a socialist state, the only violence carried out that would be condoned by society would be that of the people's militia. For if this was not the case, the existence of the people's militia in the first place would be pointless. Under socialism, the oppression of the working class by the capitalists is flipped to put the working class in control of the state apparatus. What this essentially means is that a socialist state establishes itself in various communes and regions. The working classes there will establish their own proletarian state apparatus in order to defend themselves against the still existing bourgeoisie. When worldwide socialism is established and there is no more bourgeoisie, there will no longer be the concept of the proletariat, and so as the state is a tool of class oppression, the state becomes useless and withers away. This leads to the establishment of communism, a stateless, classless society with resource abundance. The transition from socialism to communism not only happens with the removal of the bourgeoisie, but also with the unhindered flourishing of society's productive forces. Under capitalism, too much productivity is actually a bad thing. it's actually a bad thing. As too many commodities are produced, if too many commodities are produced, then the working class will not be able to buy back everything they've made, leading to economic crashes. Under socialism, however, there's no concern of saturating markets, as there are no markets, so the productive forces of society can be left to develop at their full capacity, leading to large amounts of resource abundance. A society where people are able to engage with means production when and how they want, and take out resources when and as they need them, is a truly classless society, where the ideals of from each according to his ability to each according to his need are in full effect. As class is defined by one's relation to the means of production, and under such a society where this relation is down to the individual, there are in effect no classes. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the fully formed socialist state apparatus. Under socialism between the transition between capitalism and communism, there will be a new state apparatus to serve purposes that did not exist under capitalism. Namely, the element of central planning of resources in society. Under orthodox Marxism, at least, resources would be distributed through central planning based on the use value as opposed to markets based on profit, like under capitalism. This of course means that part of the workers' state exists to plan out what society needs and how much of it, and then to tell respective workplaces what needs to be made. This should not be confused with outright authority over the workplaces, though, as it's important to remember, as described earlier, that the workers' state is a tool used by the working class to enact its will. If the body carrying out central planning abuses its power in any way or does something against the interests of the working class, they will be promptly removed and replaced. This part of the workers' state would also be likely responsible for the distribution of labour vouchers in society, as under socialism, when workers carry out labour, they receive an amount of labour vouchers corresponding to the amount they did, which they can spend on luxuries which have not been produced in abundance. Once there is enough resource abundance in society, the concepts of efficient resource distribution and labour vouchers would no longer be needed, and thus these parts of the state would wither away too. Thank you.